My name's Professor David Romano. I hold the Thomas G. Strong Chair in Middle East Politics at Missouri State University. And we bring in speakers on topics of the day related to the Middle East every semester. And it's our great pleasure to hold this strong speaker series. And we've decided to start giving a kind of avant-goût, if I could use the French, a foretaste of the talks that we're going to have here in person at MSU by doing a short interview with our upcoming speakers related to the topic that they'll be speaking about. So it's our great pleasure to be hosting this semester Professor James Devine, Professor of Political Science at Mount Allison University in New Brunswick, Canada, whose work focuses on Iran and the Gulf and the Middle East writ large. And he's going to be speaking on November 11th, in just 2 days, here in Springfield, Missouri, looking at the question of how stable is the regime in Iran. So kind of ahead of that talk, we're speaking to him while he's still in New Brunswick before he boards the plane. And we just wanted to ask him just a few quick questions to get a taste of what the full talk is going to be like. And we're going to post this and make it available on our website. So thank you, Professor Devine, for joining us today.
Thank you, David.
I guess I'll just start then. We're all watching the unfolding protests, which have been going on for almost 2 months now in Iran with great interest. And a lot of attention is now being paid to what's going on in Iran. And the people are asking what makes these protests different. If anything, Iran has suffered or gone through a number of popular protests over the last several years. We had in 2019, I believe it was the protests over the increase in fuel prices. We had some more sporadic regional protests before then over different issues. We had the big ones centered in Tehran in 2009 over the rigged election that saw President Ahmadinejad return to power. Is there something new and different in the protests we're witnessing this year in 2022?
In a lot of ways, yeah, and a number of different types of dimensions are different. Some of it's the nature of the protesters and what they're doing, and some of it's the larger political context. So first of all, these protests are unique in the fact that for the most part, they're being led by women, many very young women, some of them teenagers, some of them in their early 20s. This is not the usual sort of protest movement we've seen in the Middle East, which has been largely run by men. So the fact that we have women front and center in these movements is really quite impressive, particularly considering how harsh the regime has been in terms of cracking down. The fact that these women have been standing up to the physical force of the regime has really caught many people's attention and has created a lot of interest in it. It's interesting also in the sense that it's not something that's centered in just simply in large cities as we've often seen in the past. This is something that's been spread across the country in places which we've usually considered to be part of the regime's stronghold areas, in rural areas, in religious cities like Mashhad, areas where we would not normally expect to see protests taking place. So this is indicative, this is something that suggests something deeper is going on rather than the usual sources of opposition to the regime, right? That something is spread, or discontent is spread wider than we had expected. The protests are also different in the way that they're taking place. They're not huge protests where you're seeing hundreds of thousands of people or tens of thousands of people on the street, like 2009, where there were massive protests in major cities. These tend to be smaller protests spread out across the country. And sometimes what we've been seeing is multiple small protests taking place in a single city, almost as if the protesters are planning it that way purposely as a strategy, trying to put themselves in different places to make it hard for the regime to crack down on them. And it's not entirely clear if that's the case. It may be strategy, maybe just happenstance, but it has made it hard for the regime to react. And in fact, the whole nature of the protests themselves have made it difficult for the regime to deal with them, because whatever we may think about the Iranian government is conscious of its image, and both for the internal audience and for the international audience. So the videos and pictures of men running around beating women or shooting at women is something that's really problematic, and it's problematic, in just terms of human rights, but it's also problematic in terms of conceptions of gender relations in the Middle East. The idea that men are running around beating women from the state doesn't sit well with a lot of people. It's a very sort of problematic image for the regime to have. They see themselves as the protectors of women and the protectors of gender rights and things of that nature in their own particular way. Mm-hmm. So this is difficult for them to sort of square. They have to be very careful about the way they go about putting down these protests. And so far, this is what we've seen. They've been using force, and to a disturbing level in many ways, but they haven't used maximum force. They haven't used the amount of force that they used in 2009. They haven't used they haven't used the same amount of force that we've seen in other protests in other countries in the region. They haven't rolled out large numbers of troops and just started shooting. There has been shooting on occasions, but it seems to be more sporadic. So they're struggling to find, the regime is struggling to find an effective strategy for dealing with all of this. And so far, they haven't got one. They haven't been able to put down the protests. They've made threats, but the threats have fallen on deaf ears. The protests continue to happen. So it doesn't look like they have a ready solution for this, and they're trying to wait it out. Now, these protests are also really different and important because of the larger political context in Iran right now. Part of that is because Iran has been trying to negotiate, along with the Biden administration, a new JCPOA, a new nuclear deal. So this is happening at a particularly sensitive time in terms of Iran's foreign relations. It's also happening at a very sensitive time in terms of internal regime politics. Since President Ibrahim Raisi was elected, his election, in fact, was interpreted as a step towards consolidating power in the hands of hardliners. This is something that's been taking place or set up so that when Ali Khamenei passes away, because he's in his 80s now and his health is somewhat questionable, that the president's office will be in what would be considered ideologically safe hands. So in the past little while, what we've seen is the hardliners taking more control over more parts of the state. So this is something that's translated itself into a number of policies, in particular relations with women and the enforcement of morality laws and dress codes. So since Raisi got into office, he's cracked down on women's dress. He's cracked down on social norms. He's trying to enforce a much more hardline sort of policies. And this is all part of, as I said, a centralization of power in the hands of hardliners. This doesn't seem to be working very well. And there's starting to be pushback against it from more moderate clerics and other factions within the regime. And it's going to complicate in a number of ways the transition process when Khamenei does die. Right? One way or the other, this is going to have a lasting impact on the internal politics in the regime, whether they have to reverse some of the steps taken to concentrate power, or whether they actually double down on the concentration of power and become even more hardline.
Would you also say that it's a first that the protests seem to be crossing ethno-sectarian boundaries and uniting, not just Kurds and Baluchis this time, or Kurds, Baluchis, and Arabs, but also Azeris, Persians, Lor, and others?
That's new in the sense that they're coming around at the same time. The dissatisfaction stretching across those different communities is not new, however. Mm-hmm. And we've seen protests breaking out at different points in those communities, but not, as you say, not all at the same time and not in a coordinated way, right? Not over the same sets of issues. How when we look more closely at that, I mean, there's certainly, I think, a common frustration with the regime in terms of its economic performance. There's a common frustration with the regime in terms of the way it manages gender rights. But there's also more fundamental differences between the regime and the Kurdish community and the regime and the Baluch community and so on. So there is some commonality there, but there's also some significant differences between what's going on in the Kurdish part of the country and the Baluch part of the country and what's happening in the sort of core of the regime's territory in Tehran and Mashhad and so on.
I guess I would just think that it would worry the regime extra that it's not able to play off the different ethnic communities or Sunni versus Shia the way it did in the past. And this time they're protesting at the same time rather than sequentially,
Right.
which kind of implies a more unified opposition and hence a more significant threat to the regime.
Perhaps. That can cut two ways.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we saw this in Bahrain when the Shiite and the Sunni both were protesting against the regime during the Arab Spring. Despite the fact that you had both Sunnis and Shiites out protesting, and despite the fact that the protests were not sectarian based, the regime was still able to play the two off of each other eventually. And I think it's pretty clear that Tehran is trying to do that now, trying to categorize things as, this is all Kurdish manipulation, or it's Baluch, or it's the Saudis, or the Americans, of course. And they'll keep trying to do that. And that's one of the reasons I think we've seen a more heavy hand used, particularly in the Kurdish areas. In some ways, an escalation in the Kurdish region could actually help the regime because it makes it easier for them to try and focus attention there and make this more of a sectarian issue than an issue that's a widespread one. So it's possible. As a united front, this could be much more problematic for the regime, but they're still going to try and use divide and rule strategies, and it's still possible that they may work.
Okay. Well, I guess this sort of takes us to the issue of what happens if the regime does fold as a result of these protests? Imagine that they go on for a very long. Well, I guess before I ask that, I'll get to that question. Before I ask that, I want to ask, in what scenario does the regime fall? Like what has to happen for regime change to occur in Iran?
I guess there's a couple of scenarios where we could see it. Most of it has to do with miscalculation and political mistakes. Mm-hmm. The main one being an overly heavy-handed response. If the paramilitary forces and the Revolutionary Guard did start to use overwhelming force and then just start shooting women on the street in large numbers, the likelihood that the protests would escalate is very high. Mm-hmm. And there are calls within the Iranian parliament from other hardliners to use more force against these protests. Mm-hmm. So that would be the most likely scenario where things spin out of control. If we look at the sort of structural features of the regime is likely pretty safe. The Revolutionary Guard is tied very closely to the government in terms of ideology and in terms of its economy. Mm-hmm. It's not like in Egypt and Tunisia where the military could basically go to the president and say, you're starting to drag us down, and then put him out of power, right? Like Mubarak was put out of power by the Egyptian military and Ben Ali by the Tunisian military. That wouldn't happen. That can't happen in the Iranian case, or it's very unlikely to happen in the Iranian case, because without the Iranian regime, the IRGC has no reason to exist anymore. So they're tied to the regime. And they have a great deal of control over the economy as well. So they're likely to stand fast behind the regime right up until the bitter end. Okay, well, so there isn't, you're saying there's not so much daylight between the security forces and the regime as we saw in Tunisia and Egypt with the Arab Spring. So it's unlikely to happen through a defection of the regime's security apparatus or coercive ability. What about paralyzing the economy? That too is going to be kind of difficult. The Revolutionary Guard controls 25 to 40% of the economy by most estimates, and those estimates probably underestimate its influence because their estimates based largely on what the exact holdings of the Revolutionary Guard are. Beyond those specific holdings, the Revolutionary Guard is dug so deeply into the Iranian economy that even the companies and businesses that are not Revolutionary Guard owned rely on the other Revolutionary Guard institutions to function, such as banks. So the economy is really tied to the Revolutionary Guard as well. If we saw large-scale strikes in the oil sector, that might have an impact. But again, the oil sector in large part is controlled by the Revolutionary Guard. So they would have to be able to shut down the economy for a very long period of time to do this. I should also add one of the sections of Iranian society people often look to as an independent source of power and as a check on the government is the bazaar, the merchant class. In the 1979 revolution, the bazaar played a key role in overthrowing the Shah by doing, as you say, paralyzing the economy. But since the 1980s and the Iran-Iraq war, the bazaar has largely been co-opted and divided by the regime. So the bazaar really now does not represent an independent power base in the way that it did before. Certain sections have been co-opted by the regime, other sections have been largely marginalized by the regime. Its ability to act in a coherent and effective way as a check on the regime's power, I think, is actually quite limited. So the economy at this point still looks like the regime in Tehran is going to be able to control. And this is in many ways the result of having what is referred to as a resistance economy in place for the past 20 odd years. Right. It's built an economy which is designed to withstand pressure, not actually generate wealth or economic growth, but to keep the regime in power.
So is there a scenario where the regime collapses as a result of these protests?
As I said, miscalculation. If you look at the structural factors, right, if you look at the hardware favors the regime,
right,
but the software is more uncertain. How they play things is always going to be problematic. And there are also differences in levels of commitment to the regime within the regime itself. So we have hardliners like Raisi and Khamenei and people of that type who will not flinch from using overwhelming force to stay in power. But there are other people in the regime who are not as comfortable with this. And we've seen this already. We've seen a number of somewhat conservative clerics coming out and saying, wait a second, we're going too far. We need to start backing off in terms of the use of force. This isn't what we're supposed to be doing, and criticizing the way the Raisi government has been trying to look after social norms and social values in the state. If push comes to shove, and again, coming back to the sort of scenario where the regime does start to use overwhelming force, it's possible that you will start to see fractures within the regime on that basis.
Okay.
And there are clearly people inside the regime who profit from the regime, who their political future is tied to the regime, but they're not really true believers. They're there because that's where their career is going to go forward. They may not be willing to use the kind of force that's necessary to put down a widespread revolt. And that sort of becomes the big question right now is if these protests stay the way they are, the regime can handle them. It's if they escalate. So will the regime do something which provokes an escalation? Or will the people who are organizing the protests, to the extent that they're organized, and right now that's unclear. It looks like there's a lot of spontaneity to it. It looks like it's a very diverse network, and that's one of the reasons why it's probably been so effective, but it also creates limitations on how far they can push things forward. But if they were able to reach out to unions, perhaps, well, not so much unions, because the unions are all captured by the state too, but if they can stretch out and make contact with workers in the oil industry and other key sectors of the Iranian economy, they could put more pressure on them. They could perhaps increase the level of pressure through demonstrations to the regime to the point where it does have to use more force and it becomes a more problematic situation for them. That's in the short term. I think the long term is more of an issue realistically. And that is, as I was saying earlier, the regime is in the process of setting itself up for a transition. Khamenei will die eventually. The expectation is that Khamenei will die of old age or health-related issues before Raisi's term is out, right? So Raisi has a 4-year term, and like most Iranian presidents have served 2 terms, so he's likely to be in office for 8 years. Before those 8 years are over, Khamenei will likely pass away. And there'll have to be a transition, and that transition is going to be very complicated and very delicate, because the rules for transitioning from one Valiati Faqih, one supreme leader, to the next they're very ambiguous. They're going to have to be negotiated, and there's going to be a lot of groups vying for power. There's going to be not just moderates versus hardliners, but various flavors of moderates and people outside the regime, and on top of that, a number of different groups of hardliners themselves, who are just as competitive amongst themselves as they are with the moderates. Mm-hmm. So that process is going to be very difficult. And they looked like they were putting in place the sort of people that they thought were going to be able to handle that transition. This is going to make it more difficult for them to do that. Raisi, one of the worries when Raisi was elected was if he was the one who was expected to replace Khamenei, that being in power for 8 years would taint his image to such an extent that he would not be viable anymore as a new supreme leader. And I think that's already happened. So if they're expecting Raisi to take the job, that's going to be very hard for him to do. And if he does, he's going to be incredibly unpopular. And the legitimacy of the regime is going to be even more undermined.
So I guess that leads us to the question of, like, I mean, if the regime does weather the protests and survive them, does Iran stay the same? Is it the same country as before this happened?
For the most part, yes, but with some important differences. Mm-hmm. The more force that the regime has to use to put down these protests, particularly if it becomes more militarized in the Kurdish and the Baluch areas, the more power the IRGC is going to have. Mm-hmm. And that is destabilizing within the regime over the long term. Because if we keep in mind that the IRGC were not the group that started the revolution in 1979. They only really came to political prominence in the 1990s. The groups that were in power in the beginning were the clerics. And what we've seen developing over time is competition between the clerics and the IRGC to control the state. This would tilt the balance of power more towards the IRGC and would probably alienate a lot of the clergy. And that's a very difficult position for the regime to be in, because ultimately the IRGC relies on the legitimacy of the clergy to stay in power. They can't afford to have them alienated. So this balance of power between them is going to be brought into question one way or the other from these protests, I think. And that's going to have a long-term impact on the viability of the regime.
It occurs to me I should just point out, not all our listeners might have the acronyms up to speed, but when Professor Devine says IRGC, it's Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, or Pasdaran, the kind of wing of the armed forces of Iran. Just want to throw that out there in case so someone's asking. So let me flip that around though. Like say the regime does miscalculate, overuse force, alienates such large numbers of the population enough to get them on the streets and paralyze the country, and the regime falls. What comes next in that scenario?
That's an excellent question. Nobody can say for sure what would happen next, but it's important to remember how divided the country is. If there was a miscalculation and things did get out of hand, it's likely we would see some continuation of conflict. It wouldn't simply be a revolution where a new government comes in. I think the IRGC is so wedded to this system that it can't give in. It may lose some of its followers, but they'll continue to fight. And if that were the case, what we would likely see is a civil war of to one degree or another between remnants of the old regime and the factions that broke away, probably based largely on the regular army and the regular military forces, plus groups from different parts of the country. And what you could see is attempts to try and, in the Kurdish area, to break away, along with the Baluch area as well, also to have some sort of independence. It could be a very messy and very violent conflict. I cannot imagine a scenario where we saw in 1979, where the Shah basically just left the country, a provisional government came into place, and then we moved on to a new regime I don't want to say it was in a regular fashion, because it certainly wasn't. But it didn't involve a civil war to a large extent. There was large-scale conflict in the Kurdish areas, but it wasn't a civil war between Iranian military units.
Mm-hmm.
I think at this point in time, because of the way the military is tied to the regime in ways in which the Shah's military never was,
mm-hmm.
that we would see a civil war.
So you don't see a scenario like in Egypt where the military says, okay, we're going to shift to elections, but they kind of maintain their role in the economy behind the scenes and eventually bring back the old guard again in another name?
It would be difficult for them to do that, mm-hmm. because of the way their institution has been created. Mm-hmm. The Revolutionary Guard has been created as a safeguard for the revolution, right? As its name suggests. Mm-hmm. They're there, in fact, actually not even to fight foreign enemies. They're there to safeguard the regime inside its own territory. Mm-hmm. Their mandate is entirely ideological. Mm-hmm. If the regime goes, the constitution goes, the concept of the Valayat-e Faqih and a supreme leader, then they no longer have a mandate to be in force. The mandate to protect the country shifts to the regular military, which is not an ideological institution. Mm-hmm. So they would immediately be competitors. So the likely outcome is, of that would be conflict. The only thing they could do, mm-hmm. at a certain point, especially as Khamenei gets older, if this goes on for a while and Khamenei's health seems to decline in any way or shape or form, they could use the opportunity to push him out, keep the institutions of the state, bring in a new supreme leader, somebody who would be answerable to them, and use that as an opportunity to engage in some reforms as a way of trying to placate the population. Mm-hmm. And that might work. Mm-hmm. I'm not optimistic, but I could see that as a possible strategy they might use as things go on. But right now, Khamenei, one of the first things Khamenei started to do as these protests began was he started to become more visible. Because up until that point in time, there was a lot of rumors that his health had deteriorated and he was no longer capable of running the country. And very quickly, he started making public appearances. So right now, I don't think they're in a position to do that. They may be in a position to do that a little bit later on, though.
Okay. That's in some ways a depressing scenario for if the regime does fall. And I guess this leads to what is my final question for today, which is, what should the United States and the European states, the West in general, do in light of these protests? From both a realpolitik, self-interested angle, and from out of a concern for human rights and other norms, we know that the West would like to see the current regime displaced if possible. That would be ideally a great outcome, but it depends what comes after that, and it depends what the likelihood of achieving regime change would be. So what should their policy right now be in light of the protests that we're seeing? Well,
I'm not optimistic about the prospects for regime change or a clean regime change. Yeah. I think it's pretty clear from what I've been saying. Yeah. What they've been doing, I think, is appropriate. public condemnation of the regime's actions, increasing sanctions, putting the JCPOA talks away for the time being at least, and continuing to put pressure on Tehran and international venues as much as possible. They need to send a signal that they're supporting legitimate calls for human rights within Iran, that they're supporting the women on the street. But I don't think it's in anybody's interest to necessarily try and turn this into a civil war.
Right.
So continuing the pressure as they're doing, I think, is the best they can do. There aren't really many good options here. There's another factor that's also part of this, and maybe I should have mentioned it right up with the first question you asked me, because it does make the situation somewhat unique, and that's the situation in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. Because Iran has not stayed on the sidelines with that. It's sided quite closely with the Russians, providing them with drones and likely medium-range interballistic missiles. So they're picking sides with the Russians in the Ukraine conflict. That's further widening the gulf between Iran and the United States. Mm-hmm. So this is becoming part of the geostrategic landscape for the US and the rest of the international community going forward. It's also another reason, I would say, why Iran is the regime is in a stronger position than one might expect. Even if they do use a lot of force, they're not going to be internationally isolated. They're still going to have some support from the Russians, and they'll still have some support from the Chinese as well. Even if the United States tried to lock Iran down the way it did prior to the JCPOA or after the Trump administration started applying maximum pressure tactics, it's unlikely the US would be able to do that again. Mm-hmm. There would be outlets for Iranian trade, Iranian oil production, and also given the state of the economy right now, global economy right now, cutting off Iran's oil would be problematic in a lot of ways. So the ability to pressure Iran is, it is not as good as it once was. So there's not a lot of cards to play, and there's no sort of simple fix to this, where there's a bad regime where you get them out and you overthrow them, you cut the head off the snake, as the Saudis once asked the Americans to do with Iran. It won't solve all the problems, it'll probably just make more.
Okay, well, I have other questions. I'm gonna want to push you on a few issues. Like, the Kurdish opposition groups are saying, they have no program of secession and they can work together and they have an alternative. These are all things I want to push you on when you come in person.
Oh, great. Yes, I look forward to it. There's so much to talk about with this.
Exactly. And this is one reason we're really looking forward to your visit and having you here in Springfield, and our students are looking forward to meeting you. And it's really nice of you to make the long flight over here and join us in just 2 days, right? We're getting you from the airport tomorrow evening.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to the visit.
Thank you. And for those of you watching, this is the first of a kind of foretaste videos that we're doing for our speakers that we're bringing in every semester for the Tom Strong lecture series that we hold here at Missouri State University. And I also want to thank Professor Jean Bajalan for hosting us online for this. He's got some more technical skills than perhaps I do on these issues, and we appreciate his help on this as well. So if you can join us, if you're in the local area, James Devine will be giving his talk at Missouri State University on Friday, November 11th at 5 p.m. in the library auditorium. And the title of his talk is "How Stable is the Regime in Iran?" So I sincerely hope you can join us then in person. Thank you.